Hi, I'm Katherine Collette and I'm an author. My latest book is The Competition. It takes place across a 3-day public speaking competition. People might have heard of Toastmasters. It's a pretty similar sort of a world. Basically, all these people from around Australia come to this convention centre in Brisbane and take turns giving speeches in order to win a $40,000 prize and a trophy. We have two characters that we're deeply invested in, and they are Frances and Keith. Frances is a young woman who is a former debater, high school sort of straight A student. She's had a fall from grace. And Keith is a recent retiree who's been obsessed with winning this particular competition for millions of years. My publisher is Text. This is my second novel. My first novel was The Helpline. I think the reader for this novel is someone who is familiar with a self-help world. I think there's a bit of satire in relation to self-improvement and those sorts of things. People who've been to Toastmasters, I think, would probably see some similarities there. I consider it, it's a fairly light-hearted read. So I feel like it has broad appeal. The idea for the book came when I joined Toastmasters about 10 years ago. I remember going to a meeting and it was super welcoming, very, very enthusiastic and positive and extremely awkward. And I thought immediately, this is a pretty good setting for a book. But also at that first meeting, there was a transgender woman who was joining at the same time. And I got to know her a little bit over time. And as I got to know her, she said that she was in the process of transitioning and that this one Toastmasters meeting in this little church hall in Nunawading was the place that she was starting that process. And I cannot imagine that's an easy process, but I could 100% understand why she picked Toastmasters to start it, because it was so welcoming and so positive and all of these sorts of things. So from that very first meeting, I had this idea of Toastmasters, or public speaking clubs really, as both faintly ridiculous, but also kind of beautiful and pretty special as well. I write every day. I get up first thing and that is the first thing that I do each day, 7 days a week. But I also work as an engineer. I've worked a lot in sewerage and now I work in water, which feels like a nice move. Oh, if you weren't a writer, what would you be? Well, I am an engineer. I would, so I already have that. I would do something creative still. I've just started improv. I would probably be deeply into improv. Improv is improv comedy. So you basically come up with, you're in a group and come up with little plays and things that are funny on the spur of the moment. I really like it. It's extremely niche. You do a lot of performances and it's only other improv people that are ever in the audience. So it's this lovely little weird world of aspiring comedians, I suppose. This book was hard. I worked a lot with my editor. There's probably a few reasons that it was hard. I always had a lot of faith in the idea, but I realised in writing it that a public speaking competition is a bit of an odd thing. It's not like a sporting competition that has a real arc to it. So I think it was complicated in that sense. I also wrote a lot of it in COVID, and I think a lot of writers and creatives struggled to be creative in COVID. But there were benefits to that too. Writing a book about public speaking when you're in lockdown most of the time makes you think a lot about the value of speaking in public. And so I really came to this idea of listening, and that the real value of a public speaking club is in listening, and you spend a lot more time listening, and it really could be called a public listening club. Who helped? My editor was very helpful. My husband was surprisingly helpful, actually. I had avoided getting him to read my first novel, but this time I got him to read this one, and he was brave, blunt, but ultimately very, very useful. Yeah, he helped. I have to show him this. No one. The first draft is terrible, does not see the light of day. I try to get a draft, or I probably have refined the process a bit in my third novel that I've just sent to my agent. But I try and get it pretty refined before I send it out. And the first reader this time round with the third book was my husband again. So he did a good job the first time. So I got him to do it again. And I often will get a manuscript assessment. So I'll actually pay someone who is an editing background to read it for me. I do have writing buddies. I think they're a great idea. I have a writers group that is probably the most pivotal thing on my writing journey was when that little group came together. It came together out of RMIT, where I was studying at the time. That's probably getting to 10 years ago now. We still meet. We go on retreats 3 or 4 times a year. Critical, absolutely critical. We don't workshop anymore though. We started out workshopping, but we've stopped. Now we go on retreats and then we have dinner and drinks and talk. I think it's very therapeutic to have a writing group. I think my least favourite part of the process is the waiting. You spend a lot of time waiting. I think it's hard when you've sent what you're waiting for feedback. That's sort of the space I'm in at the moment, where you refresh your email every sort of 3 minutes. I am a big reader. I always read books. I try, depending on what I'm writing, I won't read that type of book, but I'll always read books. Oh, which fictional character from a book would you most like to be? All I can think of is Adrian Mole. And I don't think I would want to be Adrian Mole. I'm going to say Hermione from Harry Potter, because she's very smart and she's very brave. And I always kind of wanted to go to boarding school. And a magical one would be, particularly good. The podcast is called The First Time, and I do it with Kate Mildenhall, who's also an author. Her most recent book is The Motherfold, which is brilliant. It started when my first book came out, and I had all these questions that I was asking Kate. Things like, when you do an author talk, what do you talk about? What is the launch like? What if I hate the title of the book? All of these sorts of things. And I was constantly asking her. And so we thought, well, other people who write and authors probably are asking the same sorts of questions. And she had answers, but she only had answers from her sort of sample size of one. So we started a podcast, and it still sort of has these 2 parts. One around us discussing writing and the experience of being published and all the things that I was going through at the time. And then the other is interviewing other Australian authors and asking them the same sorts of questions, particularly about their first time with a book coming out and how they'd come to get an agent or an author and all that sort of stuff. It's been going for 5 seasons now, and it feels like this thing of neither of us can believe our luck, because we get sent lots of books and we get to speak to authors that we admire and ask them the questions that we're burning to know the answers to. So, it's been a wonderful experience. I get asked that a bit. The one piece of advice that I always give, and I think it is guaranteed to infinitely improve your chances of being published, is to finish writing the book. It's so simple, but it's surprising when you're in writing courses and studying creative writing. You will look around the room and there will be people that are so talented, and you think, oh my God, that person is just, I cannot wait to read. It's inevitable they'll get published and I cannot wait to read what they write. But they don't always finish. A book that I would recommend is Carolyn Petit's The Natural History of Love, she's an Australian author. It is set 1800s-ish, partly set in Australia, partly set in Brazil and France. And it basically follows a young Brazilian woman who meets a French naturalist, kind of a botanist type person who is interested in natural history. They have a baby out of wedlock, and they end up migrating to Australia. It's got a real signature of all things by Elizabeth Gilbert vibe. It's a wonderful book, and I highly recommend it. It's a middle grade book that is set, so it's quite different. As I said, I'm an engineer. I've worked a long time in sewerage. The Werribee Treatment Farm, which is the big sewerage farm out in Werribee, used to have a little town attached to it. So that town doesn't exist anymore, but the book takes place in the town as if the town did still exist. And it is currently a mix of writing and comics. So it sort of goes between the two. So my husband has read it, and I'm about to read it to my kids. I've sent it to my agent, about to read it to my kids, who are very enthusiastic to read it, but also very honest. So we'll see. I think it was about simplicity. It was actually a nice, it felt like a much easier book to write. It was about simplicity, and I think I felt really immersed in that middle grade world because I was reading a lot to my kids, and fast paced. Yeah. I think that the pace of it feels, there's not a lot of wriggle room with that young an audience because they lose attention pretty quick. Yeah. It's been fun doing the comics, actually. I'm a terrible drawer, but that bit's been fun as well. Thank you for having me.